He never said the word out loud. Not once. Not even years later when his hands had gone soft and his eyes had gone somewhere else, and the only thing left of him that still worked was the part that remembered. He'd talk around it. He'd describe the shape of it, the weight of it across his shoulders when he tried to drag it, the smell that came off the hide when the snow started to melt against it. But he never gave it a name. I think because he didn't have one. I think nobody did. This was the winter of 1907. Up in the hollows above what they used to call Black Briar, which sits, or sat, I should say, because most of it isn't there anymore, somewhere along the eastern ridge of the Blue Ridge, on the Virginia side of the line, not far from where the old logging road bends down toward Damascus. You can still find the road. You can't really find the hollow. The names changed after the Second War, and a lot of those little settlements just got swallowed up by the Forest Service maps and renamed something else, or nothing at all. The man's name was Elias. I'm going to call him that. The records I have are inconsistent about the surname. One census lists him as Elias Coyle, another spells it Coyne, and a third has him down as Elias Coyle, which I think is probably the right one, but I can't promise. He was 41 years old that winter. He'd been a trapper since he was a boy. His father had done it before him on the same ridges, with the same kind of traps and the same kind of stubbornness. And there's a photograph somewhere. I haven't been able to find it in years, but I've held it in my hands, of the two of them standing in front of a cabin with a string of pelts between them, both of them looking past the camera like they'd rather be doing anything else. I want to be careful here, because the story has been told a lot of different ways, and most of the versions you'll find now are wrong. The bad ones are the ones that got picked up in the 1970s, when people started writing little paperbacks about Appalachian folklore and they needed material. They added things. They invented dialogue. They gave the thing in the woods a name or a shape or a face, and that's not what happened. What happened was much smaller and much quieter and in some ways much worse, because nothing about it gives you anywhere to put it down. So, Elias was running his line that winter. He had a circuit of about, I think it was 27 traps, set out across maybe 8 or 9 miles of ridge and creek bottom. He'd walk it every 2 days, sometimes every 3 if the weather got bad, which it did that year. The winter of 1907 was the worst winter anyone in that part of the country could remember, and the people there could remember a lot of bad winters. There was snow on the ground from the second week of November, straight through to the middle of March. The creeks froze so deep the trout died in them. The deer came down out of the high country and started eating the bark off the apple trees in people's yards, which is something they don't normally do unless they're already most of the way to starving. Elias kept a kind of journal. It wasn't a real journal. He wasn't a literary man. He barely had what you'd call schooling, but he kept a little notebook in which he wrote down the date and the catch and sometimes the weather. The notebook still exists. It's in a private collection now, last I heard, somewhere in North Carolina, and the man who owns it doesn't like to show it to people anymore because he says it's been damaged by too much handling. But I saw it once, in 1998, in a library in Boone, and I copied out a few of the entries by hand. The entries from January of that year are mostly just numbers. 2 muskrat, 1 fox, 3 muskrat, 1 fox, 1 mink. The handwriting is small and careful and slants a little to the left. Then, on January 29th, there's a longer entry. It reads, and I'm working from memory here, but I'm fairly confident, shot something on the North Fork, not a bear, brought down the hide. That's all it says. 3 short sentences, then nothing for 9 days. The next entry, on February 7th, just says, cannot sleep. That's the part of the journal that everybody who's seen it agrees on. Those 2 entries. The rest gets disputed. So what happened, as best as anyone has been able to put together, is that on that morning of the 29th, Elias was working the upper line, the one that ran along the North Fork of what people then called Coffin Creek. I don't know why it was called that. There's a lot of creeks in that part of the country with names like that, and most of the time, nobody remembers anymore. He'd reset a trap that had been sprung empty the day before, and he was on his way back down toward the cabin, and he saw something moving in the brush about. He said about 60 yards off, but he also said about 120 yards off, in a different telling, so I don't really know, far enough that he couldn't see it clearly. Close enough that he could tell something was wrong with the way it was moving. He thought it was a bear at first. Then he thought it was a man, because it seemed to be upright. Then he decided it was a bear again, because of the size, and because the way it was moving, kind of dragging, suggested it was hurt. There'd been a bear in the area that he and another trapper, a man named Hollis, had wounded back in November and never finished. They'd both felt bad about it. You don't leave a wounded animal if you can help it. So when Elias saw this thing moving in the brush, his first thought was that it was that bear, finally coming down to die where he could find it. He fired. He was a good shot. He fired once and the thing went down and didn't get back up. He waited a while before he approached, because a wounded bear is a wounded bear, and you don't walk up on one until you're sure. He smoked a pipe. He said later, this is from the only interview anyone ever did with him, which I'll get to. He said later that he sat there in the snow and smoked a whole pipe before he went down to where the thing was lying, and that while he was sitting there, he felt the strangest thing. He felt like he was being watched from behind. He kept turning around. There was nothing there, but the feeling didn't go away. When he finally got down to it, he saw it wasn't a bear. He couldn't tell you what it was. That's the part he could never get past. In any of the times he tried to talk about it, he couldn't tell you what it was. He could tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a deer or a boar or a wolf or a panther, all of which were animals he knew. It was about the size of a smallish bear, but the limbs were too long. And the joints, he kept coming back to the joints. The joints were in the wrong places. The shoulders, he said, were too far forward. The hips were too high. The skull was too narrow. He didn't say it looked like a person. He said it looked like an animal that had been told what a person was and had gotten it slightly wrong. There was no fur on the face. There was fur on most of the body, but not on the face. The face was hairless and the color of wet clay. The eyes were open. They were brown, he said, like a cow's eyes, but smaller. He didn't say there was anything strange about the eyes. He said the eyes were the most normal thing about it. He couldn't move it. He tried. It was heavier than it should have been, given its size. He guessed it weighed about 220 pounds, maybe 250. He couldn't drag it back to the cabin. The snow was too deep, and he was alone, and the light was going. So he did the only thing he could think of. He took out his skinning knife, and he skinned it. He said it took him most of the afternoon. He said the hide came off easier than a deer's, which surprised him, and that the meat underneath was dark, almost black, and didn't smell right. He didn't take any of the meat. He just took the hide. He folded it the way you fold a hide, and he tied it across his shoulders, and he walked back to the cabin. When he got back to the cabin, he hung the hide in the smokehouse, and that was when he found the stones. This is the part of the story that I want to be very careful about, because this is where most of the bad versions go off the rails. The stones were real. They existed. There are at least 2 contemporary accounts that mention them. A letter from a man named Pickering, who was a Methodist circuit rider, and a brief mention in a Knoxville newspaper from May of that year, and they describe them roughly the same way. They were small, about the size of a man's thumbnail, some of them larger, some smaller. There were either 7 or 9 of them, depending on which account you read. They were a dark gray, almost black, and they were smooth, the way river stones are smooth, but they weren't river stones. They were too uniform. And each of them had a mark on it, a symbol, a small carved mark. The marks were not letters of any alphabet Elias or anyone he showed them to recognize. They were not numbers. They were not, as far as anybody could tell, decorative. They looked, in the descriptions I've read, more like, and I'm using the words of Pickering's letter here, the kind of small marks a man might make on a piece of wood to keep count of something. But too careful for that. Too deliberate. That's all he said about them. The stones had been sewn into the hide. That's the part I keep coming back to, the part I think about when I'm trying to sleep sometimes, even after all these years of working on stories like this. The stones had been sewn in, not embedded, not stuck, sewn, threaded through small, deliberate holes in the inside of the hide, and held there with what Elias said looked like sinew, but a finer sinew than he'd ever seen, almost like a thread. They were arranged in a pattern. He couldn't say what the pattern was. He didn't have words for it, but he could draw it, and he did draw it, several years later, for the only man who ever interviewed him about any of this, and there's a copy of that drawing, or copy of a copy, in the archive at one of the universities down there, but I'm not going to say which one because the family asked me not to. And what I want to say is this. Somebody had sewn those stones into the hide of the thing. Somebody had done that at some point before Elias shot it. And whoever had done it from the inside. This is what I think kept him awake. This is what I think the journal entry on February 7th was about. Not what he'd shot, not what it had looked like, but the fact that something had been done to it by someone that he could not explain. He didn't tell anyone for almost a week. He stayed in the cabin. He didn't run his trap line. He didn't go down to the settlement. The snow was bad enough that nobody would have expected him to, so nobody came looking. On about the 6th or 7th of February, a man named Whit Bowman walked up to check on him. Bowman was a neighbor, sort of, about 2 miles down the ridge, and Elias let him in and gave him coffee and didn't say anything about the hide or the stones until Bowman was about to leave. Then he asked Bowman to come look at something. Bowman looked. Bowman didn't say much. He went home. He came back the next day with 2 other men, his brother, and a man named Tillman, and the 3 of them looked at the hide together, and they looked at the stones, and they didn't say much either, and then they all went home. None of them spoke about it for a long time. The story that the 4 of them had seen the hide didn't really get out into the community until the spring. And even then, it got out the way these things get out in small places, sideways, in pieces, with most of the meaning stripped off. What happened next is harder to pin down. Within about 10 days of Bowman and the others coming to see the hide, the men who ran trap lines and hunting camps in that part of the ridge started to leave. Not all at once, not in a panic. Just one by one over the course of maybe 2 weeks, they packed up their gear and came down out of the woods. A man named Cates abandoned a camp on the South Fork that he'd kept for 15 years. A pair of brothers named Sharp walked away from a cabin they'd built the summer before. Hollis, the same Hollis who'd helped Elias wound the bear back in November, told his wife he wasn't going up the ridge again that season, and when she asked him why, he said he didn't want to talk about it, and he never did. None of them said it was because of what Elias had found. None of them mentioned the hide or the stones or the thing itself. They just left. They came down. They stayed in the settlement. And the parents in the settlement started telling their children to stay out of the woods after dark. This wasn't a new instruction. Parents in that part of the country had been telling their children to stay out of the woods after dark for as long as there had been parents and children in woods. But it was, by all the accounts I've been able to find, it was more emphatic that winter. It was given without the usual context. It was given without the usual list of reasons. Bears, panthers, getting lost, falling in a creek. It was given as a flat instruction with no explanation, and the children, by all accounts, didn't argue. The hide did not survive. This is the part of the story that I have the hardest time with, because the versions are all different and none of them quite line up. Some accounts say Elias burned it himself sometime in March after a series of nights in which he said he heard something moving around the smokehouse. Other accounts say his brother burned it, or that Bowman did, or that it was buried instead of burned. The most detailed account, which comes from a man named Reverend Pickering, the same Methodist circuit rider I mentioned, who knew Elias slightly, and who wrote a long letter about the affair to a colleague in Lynchburg in 1912, says that Elias took the hide and the stones together to a place on the North Fork that he didn't name, and that he put them in the ground, and that he covered the place with rocks, and that he never told anyone where it was. The stones, in that account, went into the ground with the hide, which means that if the account is accurate, they're still up there somewhere. I find that hard to think about. I have walked parts of that ridge, not looking for anything in particular, just walking. And every time I have walked it, I have thought about those stones being in the ground somewhere underneath me, with their small, careful marks, and I have walked a little faster than I meant to. Elias lived another 26 years. He married, late, a woman named Della from over near Abingdon, and they had no children. He stopped trapping in about 1912 or 13. He worked for a while at a sawmill, and then later, after the First War, he kept a small store at a crossroads that doesn't exist anymore. He died in 1933 of what the death certificate calls pneumonia, although the man who wrote his obituary said he had been in poor health for years and that his mind had been wandering for the last decade of his life. The interview I keep mentioning happened in 1931. A man named, and I'm going to leave his name out of this, because his family has asked me to, a man came up from one of the universities to collect folklore. He was making a kind of survey, the way they did then, going from settlement to settlement, asking the old people to tell him stories. He heard about Elias from someone in the community, and he went out to the little house at the crossroads, and he sat with Elias for the better part of an afternoon. The interview was written down. Most of it was about other things. Songs Elias remembered from his grandfather, stories about a great uncle who'd fought in the war, the usual material. But near the end of it, the interviewer asked Elias about the winter of 1907, and Elias talked. He talked for almost an hour. The interviewer wrote down what he said in a kind of shorthand. The transcript is uneven. There are places where the handwriting goes a little wild, like the interviewer was having trouble keeping up. And there are places where Elias seems to be saying things and then taking them back, or saying things that contradict what he said 5 minutes before. He says at one point that there were 7 stones. Then later he says 9. He says at one point that the thing was lying on its back when he found it. Then he says it was lying on its side. He says the eyes were open. He says the eyes were closed. He says it was about 60 yards away when he fired. He says it was 120. I don't think he was lying. I think he had been turning it over in his head for 24 years by then, and the edges had started to wear off, the way edges do. I think he was telling the interviewer the truth, in the sense that he was telling him what he remembered, and what he remembered was no longer entirely the same as what had happened. But there's one part of the interview that doesn't drift. There's one part that is the same every time he comes back to it, in the same words, with the same emphasis. And the interviewer underlined it. You can see the underlining on the transcript. He underlined it twice. What Elias said in that part was this. He said that on the night he brought the hide back to the cabin, after he had hung it in the smokehouse and gone inside and sat down to eat, he heard something walking around the cabin. He said it didn't sound like an animal. He said it didn't sound like a man, He said it walked very slowly all the way around the cabin once, and then stopped, and then walked all the way around it again, the other way. He said he sat very still, with his rifle across his knees, and he listened to it walk. And he said that when it stopped the second time, he heard it standing outside the door, just standing there, not moving, not breathing, just standing. And then he heard it walk away. He said it walked away in the direction of the smokehouse, and he heard the smokehouse door open, and he heard it stay in there for a long time. And then he heard the smokehouse door close, and he heard it walk away into the woods, and he didn't hear it again. In the morning, he said, the hide was still there. The stones were still in it. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. But he said, and this is the part that the interviewer underlined twice, he said that the hide had been folded differently. He had folded it one way when he hung it, and in the morning it had been folded another way, neatly, carefully, the way someone might fold something they were getting ready to take with them. He never went back up the North Fork after that winter, not once. He told the interviewer that he had stayed off that part of the ridge for the rest of his life, and that he had asked Della, when they were married, never to let anyone in their family go up that way either, and that, as far as he knew, none of them ever had. The interviewer asked him at the end what he thought it had been, the thing he had shot. Elias didn't answer the question. He answered a different one. He said, and this is the last line of the transcript, and I have looked at it more times than I can count. He said, I don't think there was only the one. That's where the interview ends. There are stories after that. There are always stories. In the 1940s, a man working for the Forest Service on a survey of timber on what was by then federal land claimed to have come across a clearing on the North Fork where the ground had been cleared in a circle and where there were what he described as small piles of stones arranged in a way that did not seem natural. He didn't describe them further. He didn't mark the location on his map. He went home and he wrote 2 sentences about it in his report, and that was all. In the 1960s, 2 hikers on what had become a stretch of the Appalachian Trail reported that they had heard something walking around their tent at night, slowly, in a circle, and then in the other direction, and then standing outside the tent for a long time before walking off. They reported it to a ranger. The ranger told them it was probably a bear. They said it didn't sound like a bear. The ranger said, bears sound like a lot of things. They went home. One of them wrote about it much later in a small magazine that I don't think exists anymore. The other one didn't talk about it at all. There's a man I spoke to once in the 1990s who lived in a holler not far from where Black Briar used to be. He was old by then. His grandfather had known Elias. I asked him if he had ever heard the story. He said he had. I asked him if he believed it. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, and I am quoting him exactly because I wrote it down as soon as I left. He said, I believe my grandfather, and my grandfather believed Elias, and that's about as far as I go with it. I asked him if he ever went up on the North Fork. He said he did not. I asked him why. He said, because my grandfather told me not to. And I have done a lot of foolish things in my life, but I have never done that one. Some stories don't really end. They just stop getting told for a while, and then somebody finds the notebook, or the letter, or the transcript, and they get told again. And the people who tell them aren't sure what they're telling exactly, but they tell them anyway, because somebody has to. Because the alternative is to let them go quiet, and there's already too much that's gone quiet up in those mountains. I don't know what Elias shot that morning. I don't think he did either. I just know he stopped going up that part of the ridge. And the men who lived around him stopped going up there too. And the children stayed out of the woods after dark, and the hide went into the ground somewhere, with its small, careful stones, and the woods kept on being the woods, that's all.